Welcome to the Classical Commons podcast, a conversation exploring the ideas, people, and trends in classical education. I'm Rob Jackson, founder of this digital platform, connecting classical school communities to talent and resources nationwide. Today's guest is a classicist, a professor and scholar, a translator of French philosophers, and an academic entrepreneur who's establishing a classical beachhead, as it were, in Europe through the development of programs and publications with Memoria Press and Memoria College. Though he has all the right credentials, if you look at his Oxford degrees and so forth, Brian Lapsa is not the typical academic, as we shall see. So welcome, Brian. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Rob. I'm really happy to be here.
You know, you spent a good bit of time in the UK, United Kingdom, and in Britain, and that focus there on the classics and classical education reminded me of a poem that's often cited because it was written by a lyric that was written by a classicist and an educator, Matthew Arnold, in Dover Beach. He talks about the sea of faith receding, right? That its melancholy, long withdrawing roar could be heard from his apartment window, as it were. But that was 170 years ago. And so I thought, well, what's the state of faith like in the UK today? And what are we to make, for example, of scholars and academics? I'm thinking here of people like Tom Holland and Richard Dawkins, who are calling for a restoration of cultural Christianity. They seem to recognize there's some merits there in Western Civ. What is the state of faith in the UK today, Brian?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. And I'm glad you started with Arnold in a sense, because you and I met for the first time, I think in person, the only time at Oriel College, which was Matthew Arnold's own college. So it's very fitting in that sense. Yes, the long withdrawal of the sea of faith. I think it's still underway, although there's it's certainly gone a long way, and I would say, being rather hopeful, it's both better and worse than it was when Arnold wrote those lines. So what do I mean by that? It's worse in the sense that probably almost everybody in that day would have identified as Christian in some sense. Yeah. And we shouldn't have an illusion of everyone turning up to church on Sundays. That wasn't the case. Industrial Revolution really aggravated the de-churching of the British population, but unquestionably a more pious Christianity or widespread piety in Christian England than we observe now. So just to make that concrete, it's probably on a very, very good Sunday, you might have 5% of the British population in church. But I think the most recent data I saw said something like 2 to 3%. Certainly for the Church of England, an interesting historical inflection point for the Church of England is that now something like roughly equal numbers of Catholics and Anglicans are in church on a given Sunday. Which since the Reformation is quite remarkable. Indeed. So in that sense, in terms of a broadly shared Christian culture, that is pretty well gone. It's much more advanced than in Arnold's day. It's still the case that something like maybe 40% of Britons identify as Christian, but that's down from just a few years ago at 50%. Meantime, you have maybe 5% identifying as Muslim, and about 0.5% of those, so almost as many as go to an Anglican church on Sunday, will go to a mosque on Friday. So the situation has changed dramatically since Arnold's day. On the other hand, this was something that one of Arnold's contemporaries, another Oriel man, John Henry Newman, was very keen to comment on. People in Arnold's day did not necessarily always reckon with the fact that much of what they relied on for their faith was part of a collapsing structure of state and culture that was less and less interested in furthering Christianity. And so Newman was recently pointed to a remarkable speech by Newman called his Biglietto speech when he received the formal notification of his elevation to the cardinalate. He's already in Rome, so he's been informed, but he receives a formal paper. And he gave some remarks on this, and he paints just a scathing depiction of Christianity in the England of the day. And he anticipates, in effect, the great disappearance of faith. And this was a common theme in the Oxford movement, which he participated. But it hadn't, let's say, the effects that some visionaries like Newman, Keble, others anticipated had not yet come to fruition. Now they have. This also means, and this is sort of come to the hopeful part of my response, probably more, I would say almost all of those who do show up to church on any given Sunday are quite aware of the fact that they don't have the support of that state cultural apparatus so many in the 19th century would have relied on. And by the way, I don't mean to say it's a bad thing that was in place at some point. Quite to the contrary, I think it helped further public faith. But it is the case that now those who do show up don't reckon with it. And that can make them extremely motivated and extremely creative. And it's that sort of, that feature of contemporary Christianity in Britain, which gives me hope.
Yeah. Well, I ask about the faith in part because I'm very interested, as I know you are, in culture. And right there at the heart of the very word is cult, and the cult, or that which is elevated, that which we aspire to, which we see as the purpose, the ends of human life, are really instantiated in the cult, in a religion, oftentimes, which of course has extensions in a philosophy, a view of the world. And so my references to Holland and Dawkins are maybe to flesh out this idea that if the waning of faith, or at least the organized institutional forms of faith in Britain, have indeed gone, are in recession, is there something of an impulse, a hopeful one, as you suggest, to recover something of that? Maybe they don't quite know what, but there is at least some hunger, some desire to recover the cultural forms that once gave shape to the communal life, right, of the Britons.
Yes, that's a great point. Thanks for reminding me of the Dawkins and Holland question. I think they're two slightly different cases. I would see Holland as being much more sympathetic to the content of faith, although I haven't followed him closely. I don't know exactly where he is with that, but he has had an opening to faith which is a bit ahead of Dawkins. Nonetheless, the reversal that Dawkins has made, or at least the shift that Dawkins has made, is really, really striking for those of us who remember the Dawkins of the, let's say, early to mid 2000s.
Right, that's right.
The high point of a new atheism, which, for as striking as it was in the American context, really was formative for a whole generation of Britons in a way that I don't think it exactly was for most Americans. So there's sort of always the edgy atheist clique in the high school who'd be really keen on Dawkins and Hitchens and so on. But in Britain, from what I understand, it really saturated the culture. The fact that Dawkins is now a bit less critical on, let's say, some cultural elements of Christianity is very interesting. I think it's partly a consequence of the rise of other new ideologies that he finds much more alarming than the old cultural Christianity, which he rejected. And those would be things from some of the so-called woke ideologies to radical Islamism, this sort of thing. So it's significant that some of Christianity's greatest critics of 20 years ago are now saying, well, maybe there's a bit of room for it. Nonetheless, I would say that what Dawkins probably hopes to recover is something like that late 19th century mood that Arnold was capturing in his poem. Matthew Arnold himself, an example of sort of ambiguous relation to
right. That's right.
In spite of his father was one of the most prominent Christians in Britain, died young. Arnold grows up benefiting from the kind of education that his father advocated for, and then, as far as I understand, settling in a somewhat uneasy mood between atheism and agnosticism, maybe occasionally a bit of deism, which he didn't necessarily always advertise, not even as openly as in the poem you quoted, but which was nonetheless there. And so that left him advocating, including his work in schools as an inspector of schools around the United Kingdom, for a sort of morality, a strongly ethical Christianity, a strongly, in many ways, Christian ethos, love of neighbor, self-sacrifice, that sort of thing. But it had no basis in the metaphysical claims of faith. And that's precisely what Newman was criticizing at exactly the same time. So yes, in a sense, I'd rather have Dawkins as a friend than as an enemy, or even just as a fellow traveler. How far it will ultimately go, I'm not terribly convinced, but it's a possible turn.
I appreciate your willingness just to speculate, in as much as you're there on the ground. But you're an expat. I mean, you originate from here, from the States, and I'd like to do a little bit of recap of where you've come from and how you got involved in higher education to begin with. What attracted you to the life of a scholar?
It's a great question. I grew up mostly in Massachusetts. I was born in Pennsylvania. We moved around a fair bit, partly because my dad was, for part of his career, in the academic world. So academia was somewhere in the background, I suppose. We're all of us very, very fortunate, that this, my siblings and I, that we were able to go to university and go on for higher degrees. And I think my family always really emphasized the life of the mind and reading, and I always loved reading. And so it was natural for me in a way that that really made me shocked when I learned for the first time that most Americans do not go to any level of college or university.
Right.
And I realized I had been in quite a bubble. But in terms of, I suppose, my personal vocation, that suited me to some extent, and that, as I say, I always loved reading. When I did go off to university, the intellectual milieu there had a big influence on my own return to and rediscovery of Christianity. So I suppose adding that element to it, because that came about through a particular milieu in which literature was prized, in which philosophy and theology were regularly discussed, in a very thick culture, that I suppose in some ways made it a very attractive field to continue working in. So,
you want to be more specific? Was this the milieu that you're referencing? Is this primarily at UVA?
That's right. Yeah, University of Virginia. Yep.
And what what professors or what activities or groups were you a part of that really gave you that sort of atmospheric encounter, right, with the humanities?
Great question. So, I mean, in rapid succession, just a friend on my dormitory hall, first of all.
Yeah.
The Dominican chaplaincy there was excellent. There was enough going on in the life of the chaplaincy, just run by students, both officially and unofficially. Unofficially, there was a really remarkable character who just had I think he was double majoring in mathematics and biology and linguistics or something like that. But he taught Thomistic philosophy on the side, and just for a little group of us. And so we'd read Neo-Scholasticism every Friday afternoon, or whatever it was. So it was kind of a slightly rarefied milieu.
Indeed.
And then I ended up taking a couple of courses with Professor Vigen Guroyan, now retired, but still very active in the classical education world.
Sure.
So those were theology classes that I took with him. And he had a way of inviting a number of his students up to his home, where he and his wife kept a beautiful garden, and we'd pull weeds and harvest vegetables and such by day, and then he and his wife would prepare this delicious meal, and we'd discuss Flannery O'Connor.
Oh, that's wonderful.
C.S. Eliot into the evening, and he also helped run the Burke Society, which would do these trips up to Mecosta to visit Russell Kirk's.
Oh my goodness! I don't think I'd heard of that. I've heard of a couple of Guroyan students mention the hospitality and just the openness. I didn't realize that they made pilgrimages, as it were, to Kirk's homestead.
We did, and I think I went twice. And Mrs. Kirk is just absolutely wonderful, consummate hostess.
Right.
Very unexpected elegance in the middle of really nowhere in rural Michigan.
Right.
So that was just a world in itself. And all told, many of these experiences, you could probably consolidate them into a couple of weeks or a month. And the story I often tell is when I graduated, I felt I had discovered this whole world really just in the last couple of semesters of my time at UVA. And I was very blessed again to get a good job out of university. It wasn't necessarily in the line of work that I was hoping to go into, but I was happy to have a job which would pay debts. And but I remember the week after term finished and before graduation, a couple of friends and I camped out at Professor Garoyan's house, and we built a big fence, which I'm happy to say is still standing. I was there visiting again this summer to keep the deer out of his beautiful garden. And so I'd wake up early, I'd read from the Iliad because I finally understood there's this tradition of Western letters, and they are in conversation with each other, and it's no bad thing to go back to the beginning. So I'd wake up, read a bit of the Iliad, we'd have breakfast, great fry up of a breakfast, and then we'd go out and dig holes and put posts in the ground and work all day and get really sunburnt, and then come in exhausted and read and so on, and repeat the next day. So that was my sort of send off from UVA, and I understood, okay, I'm not quite done with this whole reading and studying thing.
Right. No, in fact, just beginning, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Is you familiar with the Schaeffer-Labrie Foundation or the Labrie communities throughout Europe?
I'm afraid I'm not. You have to.
So Francis Schaeffer, anyhow, for those who may have heard of Francis Schaeffer and the work that he and his wife did in developing communities of an evangelical stripe, but focused on reading into the tradition and mixing up study with leisure and work, right? That the whole community was founded on the idea that we're going to work a little bit today and, take care of the homestead, and we're going to study, and we're going to enjoy the company of our companionship together. Anyhow, very much sounds like you had a very kind of a small scale vegan Goroyan centered community there as an opportunity for you to send off from UVA. That's wonderful.
That's absolutely right. And tried to imitate that now and again since. So my dad's side of the family from Latvia, and I actually live in Riga now. That's home base, although I'm not there at the moment. But we set up with some friends who live on a farm. We set up a weekend. I think we were doing it about monthly. We ran it for a couple of years, and then I was away too much and wasn't able. Since coming back, I've been living in the city, but where we would have things like milking goats and pulling vegetables and taking care of the horse, interspersed with things like reading the Apology of Socrates, or a bit of the Summa, or Macbeth in a decent Latvian translation. So with Latvian, at that point, I think they're mostly high schoolers, early college students.
Oh my goodness. I love it. The gift that just passing it along.
It's a winning formula. So.
That's right. Listen, you ended up getting involved in the classics. That became your deeper scholarly interest, and specifically you were focused on the history and philosophy of education. So that's of great interest to those of us in classical education and this sort of Renaissance movement. I would be interested in you providing us just a little bit of framing the most striking features, right, that you noticed from education in late antiquity that really stood out, especially perhaps by comparison or contrast with what your own formative years would have given you. Just show us a little bit of what you saw there and what drew you to that topic.
Absolutely, it's a great question. I was really interested in the confluence in a more general way of Christianity and the classical world, and a key century for that is the fourth, when you have finally probably the majority of, let's say, the intellectual, literary classes moving over to Christianity. And then the question is, what do they do with this patrimony? And that's a whole story in itself. But for one reason or another, I was drawn in particular to the question of moral exemplars, and that's probably where I would start my answer in terms of what was most different about my formation, which was in a state school, public school in Massachusetts. And that which someone attending school, which granted there were not vast numbers of in the 4th century. That's where the greatest difference, I think, may lie. There's an ethos of mimesis or imitation, and rather shamelessly. This is not something to be ashamed of. You're imitating some model, and that imitation is twofold. There's a technical imitation, and there's an ethical imitation. And this comes up again and again in texts about the character of the teacher, why it's important that a teacher be also a good human being, because they're transmitting not just the technical side of their fields, whether it's how to write a letter correctly or how to formulate a sentence correctly or how to create a beautiful discourse, but also something in their character. There's a sense in which this can always be maybe exaggerated in a moralizing key, but I think the fundamental insight is absolutely right, and that's that we tend to become like those from whom we learn.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. And this is found in the Gospels as well. And rather than shying away from that in the way that many contemporary approaches to education do, in which creativity is the real value, and anything that smacks of imitation is thought to be slavish or uncreative, the ancients, in a general way, and it's still true in late antiquity, and in this sense, late antiquity is in perfect continuity with what came before, rather sought to harness that aspect of our anthropology. So, okay, we're going to imitate something. It's fine. Let's just make sure they're imitating the right things and doing so effectively.
Sure.
And this meant loads and loads of imitative exercises, whether it's in something as basic as handwriting, where we still tend to do that to some extent, or in something like speech. So how do you write? Well, first, it's not give the kid a pen and paper and just tell them to write anything. You present them with an example. The example is copied out meticulously, and then certain variables are introduced so as to accustom the pupil to one particular form of expression. The Hellenistic Greeks in particular were great fans of classification. You could see, to some extent, a distant mirror of the 19th century German mind, categorizing.
The philologists, yeah.
Yes, and cataloging. And so hundreds of different rhetorical figures of speech were cataloged, named, compiled, and then set in front of children for imitation until they had them down like that. And that, in a way, is just as, let's say, authoritarian or perhaps even imposed, artificial, as the post-18th century critics of that kind of education maintain. And yet, with that in the background, you have an extraordinary library or armory or pantry of tools, or whatever metaphor you'd like to use.
Yeah, that's right.
For expressing something new and genuinely creative. And
and that was understood. Was that not understood, that the end goal was that this good man, this good person, would become well-spoken? They would have imitated in order to have essentially developed their chops, to have, acquired the skill that imitation afforded them, and then they could go out on their own and, in fact, truly become creative. Was that not the end?
Absolutely, that's what. And forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but you may be referring to the formula of Cato, who says, he's speaking to his son. He says, "Orator mi fili marce est vir bonus dicendi peritus," and to say, the statesman, Marcus, my son, is a good man, skilled in speaking, and or sometimes translated. I think I've seen it translated recently, possibly by Eric Ellis, as a man of virtue, person of virtue, virtuous person, capable of persuasion, something like that. And what's interesting about that source is that Cato is not an advocate of the kind of Hellenistic overwrought rhetorical formation that I've just described, but he is a partisan of what he would see as a sensible, down-to-earth Roman formation. And where this is interesting is that the pattern of learning that I described being characteristic of ancient learning in a rather artificial literary context is just what we see in traditional societies, more like that ethos of the old Roman represents. So what I mean by that is an ethos of apprenticeship, whereby somebody who is a bit further on in life knows how to do something. He knows that the little kid doesn't yet know how to do that, and that's just a fact, and you deal with that fact. And whatever little creative impulses there may be in the person, they need to be coached somehow. And the coaching happens by imitation, which at worst can look a little bit slavish, but which then gives rise to the extraordinary flowering of art and artwork and architecture and poetry and oratory that we see coming from antiquity, and antiquities of all parts of the world. This is just a feature of traditional human society, which in the Western literary tradition assimilates things like these catalogs of figures of speech, highly developed sense of what the liberal arts are, and can become quite technical. But it's the preservation in the technical and artificial setting of a classroom or classroom equivalents when there weren't yet schools with four walls, that I think distinguishes ancient and late ancient education from what we tend to see in state schools of the late 20th, early 21st century.
Sure. So we are seeing a bit of a comeback, certainly a engagement with the sources in classical education, ad fontes, as the saying has it. And in returning to those sources, I wonder if you have any particular insights from your work as a classicist, as one who's advocated for and promoted Latin, active Latin, as it's sometimes referred to, perhaps living Latin. While you were at Jesus College there at Oxford, you were involved in the Oxford Latinitas program, developing that. Maybe tell us a little bit about how you think the language instruction, language learning of a particular active form can be beneficial to this type of education, right? Where we're recovering as we return to sources and bring them forward into our contemporary moment.
Sure. Yes, it's a great question. So just to be clear, it was mostly at Oriel, but I was very lucky to get to participate in the Jesus College pilot program of an active Latin, and now they've added Greek instruction program as an alternative to what most colleges do for teaching classics, and that's due primarily to Dr. Melinda Letts, who was a great mentor for me as well when I was there. So very lucky to have gotten to teach for that program, which is flourishing. It's up and running, good results coming in. So that's that was some great thing. And then many really wonderful people at Oxford Latinitas as well, whom I got to work with. And very, very proud to have been involved with that. And now doing a little bit of teaching on this side as well for the Veterum Sapientia Institute, which does something very similar, mostly targeting open to all, but with a special mission for the Catholic Church. And I know this is a really hot topic in classical ed circles. How do you teach that? How much Latin do you teach? Do you have to teach Latin? What does Greek have to do with this? Do you teach only the grammatical method? Can you do something else as well? And I'll anticipate the conclusion I'm going to come back to, which is that I'm more or less a compatibilist on this question, rather committed compatibilist. So there are many virtues to teaching by the grammatical method. There are many virtues to teaching by an active method. And I'm a compatibilist in part because when I look into the sources from early modernity, which is where we have the best documentation of native speakers of modern vernacular languages attempting to read deeply in Latin and Greek sources, initially there's a bit of a mix of the vernacular and the target language. For several hundred years, the norm, however, was to move eventually into speaking and writing in the target language. Well, especially Latin. There's less of this in Greek. It's a little bit less widespread, but Latin certainly, such that in my view, the best charter of classical education, which is the Jesuit order's Ratio Studiorum, itself written in Latin, presupposes throughout that the whole institution is run in Latin.
In Latin, that's right.
And in the stipulations for the Latin classes, in the early classes, it does say, of course, use some of the local language to explain. But in each year, there's a bit less of that. And even in the very, I think in the very highest years, occasionally, if it can't be conveyed otherwise than a word and the vernacular is permitted. But the shift into the target language is very clearly the goal from the start. It's partly because of the overwhelming priority of Greek and Latin sources in the curriculum. And to read a large volume of those, you need to be able not only to translate, which is a great skill in itself, but really to stay in the language. I think in Surprised by Joy, Lewis has a passage about how at some point he didn't need to rely on his dictionary or translating into and out of when he was reading. I think the example he gives is Homer, although it could have been one of the tragedians. And he says, it just suddenly felt like you're flying. And so when you see the word, you see the thing itself rather than seeing in your mind the English word behind the.
Sure.
And I think that should be the goal. I realize it's not an immediately realistic one for many institutions, and I think it's absolutely important not to lose track of where we are in this historical moment, in a project of cultural recovery, in a project of recovering the educational patrimony that was jettisoned wrongly over the course of, let's say, 150 years, and not to make the perfect the enemy of the good, put very simply. So I absolutely think that where that's the only way possible, then a strictly grammatical approach allows a teacher who isn't able to speak in responsible Latin, but who understands the structure of the language. That's a wonderful way to learn, and there are other benefits that accrue to it. So the ones that are often cited, the say systematic thinking, the idea of structured approach to language, precision in
language grammar,
grammar, which is sometimes easier to teach in a foreign language than it is in your native language. All these things are true. At the same time, I think that it would be a shame if the only way of reading Caesar or Virgil or Ovid or Horace were by such painstakingly slow translations that you lose the interest by the time you get to the end of a paragraph, if you make it that far.
Yeah, if you make it that far, that's right. Yeah.
So I'm a compatibilist. I think there's some good literature on the benefits of involving things like your tongue, your lips, the organs of speech in learning, and that can play to strengths. That can be more time consuming at the start, but yes, I think I'm quite sure that there's a harmonist position that's tenable in this. I'd love to see more of that. And I think as a realistic goal, I could probably say in the next 20, 30 years, we could imagine some schools which are conducted largely in Latin.
I think that would be a delight to see, to witness, to be part of. You know, a few years ago, since you're moving in this direction, the conversation seems to be unfolding around the Latin School Association, that is a derivative of Highlands in Louisville, of Memoria Press and its activities. You ran into these folks from Memoria, and that may have changed the trajectory of your life as you're now working. You're the director of UK and European operations for Memoria Press. Tell us a little bit about how that encounter went down. What was it about Memoria that really drew you in?
It's a great question. I had been put in touch, in fact, by the aforementioned Professor Goroyan, because he was preparing some commentaries on classic fairy tales. It's a big theme of his in children's literature. And he wrote to me and said, "Hey, Brian, you're in Oxford. You probably know somebody who knows Danish and early 19th century German. I'd love to have some new translations of Hans Andersen and the Grimm brothers and so on."
Yeah.
So he then put me in touch with Memoria to try to find them someone. I'm not sure if that ever went anywhere, but in the course of our correspondence, they said, we're bringing a group of Memoria College students over to Oxford. and it'd be good to meet you to talk about some of this. And then over the course of that correspondence, it became clear that they could benefit from maybe an inside look at some of the colleges, or something fell through with the space that they'd organized for seminars. So I was able to find something, set that up in advance. And then I ended up spending some really delightful days with them. So meeting Martin Cawthron, Tanya Charlton, Lee Lowe, some of the other cast of characters, and then meeting some of their students as well. So I was impressed by the seriousness with which they approach the task of education, but also the cheerful spirit. Joseph Pierce was one of the lecturers on that trip, and if ever interacted with Joseph, he's one of the most cheerful men alive.
Downright jolly.
Downright, you'd have to say jolly. Yeah. So it seemed like a really great outfit, and I enjoyed my time with them. My concern at that point was I was getting to the end of my dissertation. I really needed to submit by a pretty hard deadline. And I also thought, well, I'll probably go somewhere else after this. They seem like good people. I want them to make the right sorts of connections in Oxford, so if they come back here, they'll know whose door to knock on, basically. Mm-hmm. But a week later, and I was praying really hard for a job at the same time. A week later, I got an email saying, more or less, write yourself a job description. I said, well, that's not the sort of email you get every week. So I was drawn to that, but I did some homework in the meantime, read up on the curriculum, on the reach in schools, and so on. And so the pitch I made was largely the fruit of having spent quite a bit of time in France, Belgium, less so in Germany, Latvia, and the UK, and across that range of countries, it was very clear to me that there was an educational crisis unfolding across all of civilization. And the pitch I made had to do with the fact that I thought, well, this revival of the old classical education in the US has not really yet been noticed in a serious way by most people who would be interested in it in Europe. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was on the radar of some very active and wonderful people whom I've been lucky to get to meet over the last, I suppose, 2.5 years now. But more or less, Memoria said, yes, okay, that's fine. So stay over there somewhere, and let's see what we can do. So that's how that came about.
Write your own job description. It's not a bad way to start straight out of grad school. Not a bad way to start at all. And you've become a part of Memoria College. You're one of the tutors involved with this new venture, relatively new.
Oh, you've got it right there. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And as such, I'd really be interested in what you're seeing. You described this group serious, very thoughtful. I know Martin and the others, and I'm very impressed with what they have put together. Again, even though this is not yet accredited, it seems to me like you've got more horsepower under that hood than I see in most colleges and universities. They've really amassed a remarkable faculty. And they are there, as the tagline has it, for everyone, right? The great books are for everyone. And you can choose a path that helps you personally, helps you professionally as a teacher, or potentially, again, to get a graduate degree online. So what are the essential features, right, of classical education that are coming through this program? Because especially if you're a teacher, right, if you're interested in taking this track to develop as a teacher, as a professional, you want to know what you're going to get at the end of the day. Tell us what Memoria College emphasizes and what you would describe as the essentials for a classical educator.
Good question. There are, I suppose, a couple of main streams or main elements to the course offerings. On the one hand, there are some courses which are really explicitly tailored to trying to understand what is this history of classical education in the West, what is a liberal education, and so that will involve deep reading of sources, starting from Homer and Plato and going on through Plutarch and Augustine and Aquinas and so on, and with the explicit focus on what it means to be educated, to be liberally educated, what it means to think freely. And there are also some courses which focus very practically on what this means then in the classroom. So not just what have people said about what it means to be educated, but all right, this is this kind of education which in something of a neologism we're bundling together and calling classical education. Now I know what it is. What does it look like in the classroom? And so there are some courses which focus on that, which would allow you to identify what are the main hallmarks of the so-called progressive education, which has become the norm, as opposed to traditional pedagogy, as opposed to a classical content, that sort of thing. And so that's one side. The other side is really just participating in that tradition. And that's really the majority of the classes. So I think one of the best things that we can do for our pupils, our students, and for the homeschooling families for their children, is just make a practice out of liberal learning, which is to say, approach the life of the mind, the life of study, with something of the seriousness of, to translate Newman's metaphor of a cricket game, a baseball game.
Yeah.
Which is its purposeful activity, which contains something of its end in itself. Okay, so there's something about considering things that are in the, unfortunately by now almost hackneyed trinity of the good, true, and beautiful. Considering these fine things which elevate the spirit and somehow bring us closer to both our end and our nature. It's easy not to make a hobby of that because there's nothing in our culture today, broadly speaking, which encourages us to think in that direction. And these classes are really a way for teachers, for parents, for any professionals who've just found they've not had that as part of their education. They've maybe been cheated of an educational patrimony.
Sure.
To engage in live discussions. All the classes are live with subject area experts or professors, and with their peers at a pace that's totally consistent with keeping a job and teaching and homeschooling. And a lot of them are really find that gives depth to the sort of teaching that they do in the classroom or in the homeschool setting. Yeah.
So the importance of participating, that is to say, as you said, all of these classes are live, and it's crucial that the individual participating in them is experiencing something of that liberalizing encounter with the tradition. And there's also a practical dimension, as I understand it, because you are preparing and equipping teachers to take this back to teenagers and even to elementary age students. And as such, teachers are looking for not only the experience, which I think is primary, but they are thinking of the practicalities of working in that classroom and of bringing this tradition to life for grammar school children, for high school children, and so forth. Do you have a sense from your encounters and your seminars that you've conducted for Memoria College, kind of what the teachers are most hungry for at this stage?
That's a good question. I think it depends a little bit on where they're coming from. Some of them are so well read that I stand in awe of them. So some of them have been at this for much longer than I have. Others are just starting out, and I think finding a forum in which to discuss ideas that consists of their peers rather than their pupils can be a real need. I see this a bit more with some of the teachers that I work with more on the press side than on the college side over here in Europe, where the people who discover alternative forms of education are often quite isolated. And so they're looking for some kind of community. We are starting to offer more and more classes which are on a Europe-friendly time to accommodate that, or our in-person study trips, whether Oxford or Rome, or do Greece in 2027, Rome this 2026. But I think the community is part of it, and a focused motivation to read and to make concrete the thoughts that we have while we're reading. Because if you're anything like me, often you pick up a book, you might fly through it, like, wow, that was a great book, and then something comes up, life happens, as they say, and you don't make the thoughts concrete all the time, fixed, held in place. thanks to that beautiful technology that we have of writing. That's an extraordinary gift, acquisition of humanity, the ability to freeze thoughts in time and to go back to them and consult them. So a course that keeps you to a disciplined pace of reading and writing is a real gift, especially for those with busy professional and family lives.
Sure.
So I think
that makes perfect sense. And the idea that we are equipping teachers and parents and others to place those habits to the fore of their lives, building that in, integrating that as a part of their experience, day-to-day, daily life, seems like a real benefit for them, along with the community, where they see they're not alone, right? They're with fellow travelers, as you said a few moments ago. I know we're coming to the end of our time. We're not going to have a chance to talk about French translation that you've done, Brog's work. I just going to have you back, Brian, because we're almost out of time here. But I do want to focus, just as we conclude, on two things: how parents can help to encourage the liberal arts at home with their children. That's one. And then I want to talk a little bit, if you would, just kind of a promo for the publications and the programs of Memoria that might be able to help teachers and leaders, and what you would like to recommend, some piece of advice you'd want to share. So parents, first of all, what can they do at home to bring the liberal arts to life for their own children?
That's a great question. I should start by saying I'm not married. I'm not a father, so I always approach the advice stage with a little bit of trepidation and a lot of respect. Nonetheless, I think I can share some of the things that I've seen. I've been very lucky again to have been invited into different homes and to see how families, whether it's the home education that they do or just the way they live their family life. And in particular, so I'm in France at the moment, and I've really a couple of French families over the years, both with very large numbers of children. So the one family with 9, the other family with 7, who at various points have been wonderful hosts to me. And I've noticed just in some of the things that they do. So there's a kind of a focus on an unoppressive order, I would say. So there's a normal way of doing things, and a routine that makes space for silence and for prayer. And I don't have any illusion. I've been around both of these families and others long enough to know that it's this. I don't have any illusions of a sort of quasi-monastic existence.
It gets loud sometimes, I'm sure.
I don't have kids, but I remember being one, and I have nephews and nieces and godchildren and so on. So, okay, no illusions. So maybe that's the first thing. Just drop the illusions of perfection, if you still have those. If you're a parent, I think you probably don't. Realistic enough. But do make time to have that, as you say, cultus before cultura, and which is a neologism anyways. But anyhow, give some time to God and make that a regular part of life. And that may sound like a cheap answer, but I really think that's where the focus has to be. Other than that, I think that we kind of, if we allow time for God, if we allow time for silence, things tend to flow out in the right direction. So these families might cultivate things like drawing or reading, or having the kids just put on plays, or music. It's just understood that the things, and all of these things are big commitments, and it means listening to the scratchy violin for I don't know how many years. But the understanding is there that the good things in life often are difficult. They take time, but a few minutes a day, and after a few years, it'll all be there. So just give time for that sort of thing, I would say. But that's don't impose that entirely as this kind of external lawgiver. But again, lead by example. Going back to when you asked me about what distinguishes maybe late ancient education. That mimetic character, okay? The kids are going to imitate their parents. That's clear. So maybe read a book. Let them know that you're reading a book. Maybe let them know that that's time for, this is when dad or when mom is reading a book. And you can ask me that question, or I can settle that conflict about the doll later. But this is a time that I'm prioritizing because study is important. And so model it, I suppose. that's
Yep,
what
absolutely.
You had another question in there.
Yeah, no, the Memoria Press and Memoria College, and obviously we're going to place in the show notes anything you want for us to relate to our audience. But is there anything in particular that we should be looking for in the coming year that might be helpful to teachers, to leaders, and to families?
Yeah, absolutely. So Memoria regularly publishes the Classical Teacher, which is part catalog, part collection of short essays every few months. And those are really great resources. That the essays themselves help think about what the nature of teaching is or ought to be, and then just being able to see the offerings. That's free. You can sign up for that. You get that mailed to your house and so on. And the chart in the middle in particular, which lays out all the subjects year by year. Oftentimes, I'm speaking to someone trying to explain, especially in Europe, what is this thing? I think, okay, that's nice, books for schools and so on. And then you say, well, and this is what it looks like. And then they say, oh, wow, that's really, there's everything there. So so that I think is helpful. There's a podcast, Classical, etc., which is on YouTube and I think other platforms. Memoria College has a new literary journal called Memoria, which has essays on anything related to the liberal arts, humanities, that kind of thing. So that's an interesting way to learn more. And yes, I'll send some links over for all of this.
As I said, I've got to have you back because I really want to hear more about your translation work. I think Remy Brague's work is really of significance. But there's a lot of other things you've been involved in the course of your professional life, and this is just the next chapter. And I'm delighted to see the work you're doing and hear more about some of what's happening internationally throughout Europe under your watchful care. So thank you, Brian, for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Rob. I've really appreciated being here. Very thankful for the invitation. I'd love to come back. So
will do.
Great. All right. Be well.
Bye-bye. Join us weekly on the Classical Commons podcast for updates on the Renaissance in classical liberal arts education. Subscribe to our podcast and sign up for our bi-monthly newsletter where we'll cover folks like Brian in more detail.